London, 1818, and the morning arrived cold and grey as ash, settling over Mayfair with the weight of unwelcome truth. Eleanor Ashworth woke not to the gentle sounds of a household stirring with purpose, but to whispers that slithered beneath her bedroom door like winter draughts through ill-fitted frames. She had learned long ago to distinguish the textures of servants' voices, and these carried the particular quality of scandal, barely contained. At 24 years of age, Eleanor possessed a keen awareness of her place in the world's estimation, that invisible territory occupied by eldest daughters whose faces held no remarkable beauty, whose figures inspired no poetry, whose dowries represented their sole claim to consideration. She rose from her bed with the deliberate movements of someone who had made peace with disappointment, her hand steady as she reached for her wrapper, that sensible grey garment that matched both the morning and her prospects. The whispers grew louder as she descended the stairs, and she caught fragments that assembled themselves into a picture she had secretly dreaded for years. Her father, Lord Ashworth, had finally done what his mounting debts and increasing desperation had long threatened. The card tables at White's had claimed not merely his quarterly income this time, but the small estate in Hertfordshire that constituted Eleanor's dowry, that modest property her maternal grandmother had settled upon her with the specific intention that it provide security should matrimony prove elusive. Eleanor paused on the landing, one hand gripping the banister with enough force that her knuckles blanched white against the dark wood. The thing she had always known about herself, that fundamental unworthiness that lived in her bones, had just been confirmed by the universe itself. Even the meager value assigned to her could not be preserved, could not be protected, could not survive her father's recklessness. She thought of her sister Lydia, 19 and lovely as a porcelain figure, whose betrothal to the wealthy Mr. Pemberton remained untouched by their father's disgrace, whose separate dowry from their mother's family lay safely beyond his reach. Eleanor had long accepted her role as the plain one, the sensible one, the daughter who would likely remain at home to care for aging parents while Lydia danced through ballrooms and bore beautiful children. But she had harbored one small, secret hope, barely acknowledged even in her most private thoughts, that the Hertfordshire property might someday provide a cottage of her own, a place of quiet dignity, a refuge from being forever the unmarried aunt in someone else's household. Now even that modest dream had been scattered across a gaming table by a man too drunk and too desperate to remember he was destroying his daughter's last shred of independence. The cold of the morning seemed to seep through the walls themselves, settling into Eleanor's chest as she continued down the stairs. Her face, composed into that expression of calm acceptance she had perfected over years of being overlooked, her heart folding itself into an even smaller space than it had occupied before. The Duke of Tremaine had not intended to spend his Thursday evening at White's, but a letter from his man of business regarding a shipping investment had required his presence in London, and the club provided as good a refuge as any from the empty rooms of his townhouse. Sebastian Blackwood had inherited his title at 25, and in the 7 years since, he had managed his estates with the same strategic precision that now governed his approach to everything, a quality that had made him wealthy beyond even his considerable inheritance, and isolated in ways that wealth could not remedy. He had watched Lord Ashworth's descent into desperate gambling for the better part of 2 hours, noting the particular recklessness that came not from the confidence of a man on a winning streak, but from the panic of one trying to reverse catastrophic losses. Sebastian had seen such men before, had watched them wager family heirlooms and country estates and the security of people who depended upon them, all while telling themselves the next hand would restore everything. When Ashworth laid the deed to a small Hertfordshire property on the table, his hands trembling and his cravat askew, he had muttered something about it being his daughter's settlement, but that she was plain as a post anyway, and unlikely to need it. Better to secure the family's immediate situation than preserve resources for a future that would never come. Sebastian had felt something cold settle in his chest at those words, that casual dismissal of a person's entire existence, that reduction of someone's worth to their marriage prospects and their marriage prospects to their appearance. He had not planned to enter the game, had been content to observe from his position near the fireplace with his brandy and his contempt for such waste, but he found himself standing, placing his own stake. And within 30 minutes he held the deed to property he had no use for, and Lord Ashworth had stumbled from the club with the glazed expression of a man who had not yet fully comprehended the extent of his losses. Sebastian remained, the document on the table before him, listening as other men discussed Ashworth's folly with the mixture of judgment and fascination that such disasters inspired. It was then he learned more than he wished about the plain daughter, the one deemed unmarriageable by consensus, the one whose sole security had just been scattered across the green bays by a father too selfish or too broken to protect her. Lord Pemberton mentioned that his own betrothed was the younger Ashworth girl, a beauty who had fortunately inherited a separate dowry from maternal relatives, and was not his future sister by marriage, a pitiful creature, all angles and seriousness, the sort who read too much and had opinions about things that did not concern her. The laughter that followed settled into Sebastian like a stone, and he folded the deed with careful precision, sliding it into his jacket pocket. He knew something of being observed, and found wanting by metrics that had nothing to do with actual worth, knew the particular isolation that came from being valued for all the wrong reasons, and he found that the cold thing in his chest had transformed into something sharper, something that demanded action rather than passive observation of injustice. The news travelled through Mayfair society with the particular velocity reserved for scandals involving gambling and financial ruin, and by the afternoon of that grey morning, Eleanor found herself accompanying her mother and sister to Lady Pemberton's weekly salon, an obligation that could not be avoided without confirming the very disgrace they were pretending had not occurred. Eleanor wore her customary deep blue dress, the one that had been made over twice and still hung slightly loose on her frame, her brown hair arranged in a simple style that made no attempt at fashionable elaboration because experience had taught her that no amount of ribbon or curl would transform what nature had declined to make beautiful. She was tall where fashion preferred petite, angular where softness was admired, serious of expression where men preferred smiles that asked nothing and promised decorative silence. Her sister Lydia, by contrast, wore rose silk that set off her cream and gold colouring to perfection, her curls arranged in artful profusion, her laughter like music as she greeted the assembled ladies with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. Eleanor took her customary position in the corner near the window, the seat that allowed her to observe without being observed, to fulfill her duty as chaperone without drawing attention to her own presence. She watched her mother move through the room with brittle determination, deflecting inquiries about Lord Ashworth's whereabouts with vague mentions of business in the city, her smile fixed and her eyes hard with the effort of maintaining appearances. It was Lady Hartley who delivered the first cut, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to Eleanor's corner while maintaining the fiction of private conversation. She remarked to her companion, Mrs. Whitmore, that it was fortunate indeed that dear Lydia's prospects remained secure despite her father's misfortunes. And was it not a mercy that the elder Miss Ashworth had never entertained expectations that could now be disappointed, for a woman who had nothing to lose could not suffer the loss. Mrs. Whitmore agreed with the sympathetic cruelty of women who had never known financial insecurity, adding that Eleanor had always been the sensible one. Surely she understood that some women were meant for marriage and others for the practical support of family, and there was dignity in accepting one's place without the unseemly desperation of reaching for what was never meant to be. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the window, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that had become as natural as breathing, her face arranged in an expression of polite interest that revealed nothing of the way those words landed in her chest, like stones in deep water. She had heard such assessments before, had learned to recognize the particular tone women used when discussing those they deemed beyond consideration, that mixture of pity and satisfaction that came from observing someone whose failures made their own situations seem more secure by comparison. The card arrived on Tuesday morning, delivered by a footman in livery so fine that the Ashworth servants clustered in the hallway to whisper about ducal crests and what it might mean, and Eleanor was in the morning room mending one of her father's shirts when her mother burst through the door with an expression that mingled disbelief and calculation in equal measure. The Duke of Tremaine had requested permission to call that afternoon, a courtesy that was entirely unnecessary given his rank, but which spoke to a formality that sent Lady Ashworth into immediate action, her commands flying through the house like startled birds, as servants scrambled to polish silver that had not been used in months, and arrange flowers in the drawing-room, and prepare tea service worthy of ducal inspection. Eleanor set aside her mending and listened to her mother's instructions with the calm detachment of someone observing a play in which she had no role, understanding immediately that this call concerned Lydia, that the Duke must have seen her at some event, and been struck by her beauty as men so often were, that Eleanor's function would be to sit quietly in the corner and provide the appearance of proper chaperoning, while staying sufficiently invisible to avoid distracting from her sister's charms. Lydia herself appeared in the doorway within moments, her face flushed with excitement and triumph, already planning which dress would best display her figure while appearing appropriately modest for an afternoon call. Eleanor rose to help as she always did, following her sister upstairs to the bedroom they had shared until Lydia's betrothal had elevated her to her own chambers, watching as Lydia dismissed gown after gown with the particular cruelty of someone who had too many choices and knew it. The pale pink was too girlish, the green too bold, the white too bridal, and Eleanor stood patient and silent as her sister finally selected a cream muslin with delicate embroidery that did indeed make her look like something from a painting, all gold and rose and artful innocence. Eleanor fastened the tiny buttons along Lydia's spine, her fingers steady and practiced, listening to her sister speculate about whether the Duke preferred blondes, and whether his fortune was truly as vast as rumour suggested, and whether a duchess's coronet would suit her colouring. There was no mention of Lord Pemberton, Lydia's betrothed, no acknowledgement that she was promised to another man, only the opportunistic calculation of a beautiful woman who had learned that her appearance granted her options that others would never possess. When Lydia asked which dress Eleanor would wear, there was a moment of silence before their mother answered from the doorway that Eleanor's grey afternoon dress would be perfectly suitable, the dismissive tone making clear that Eleanor's appearance was irrelevant to the outcome of this call. Eleanor nodded and retreated to her own smaller room, changing into the grey dress that had the virtue of being neat and inoffensive and requiring no assistance to fasten, arranging her hair with the efficiency of long practice, her reflection in the mirror showing her exactly what she expected to see. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The Duke of Tremaine arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, his carriage bearing the dual crest that had sent the street into a flutter of curtain twitching and speculative observation, and Eleanor watched from the drawing-room window as he descended with the unconscious grace of a man accustomed to being observed, his dark coat fitted to perfection across shoulders that needed no padding, his features composed in an expression of polite formality that revealed nothing of his purpose. He was taller than she had expected from distant glimpses at social events she had attended in her invisible capacity, his hair dark and his eyes a striking grey that seemed to take in every detail of the house's facade as he approached. And Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety of witnessing her sister's triumphs, of knowing she would spend the next hour watching a man fall under Lydia's spell as so many had before. The butler announced him with a gravity appropriate to ducal rank, and her mother rose with a curtsy so deep it bordered on theatrical, her voice bright with welcome as she presented first Lydia, who executed a perfect curtsy with downcast eyes and a small smile that had been practiced to devastating effect, and then Eleanor herself, almost as an afterthought, the elder Miss Ashworth, who was present for propriety's sake. Sebastian bowed to each of them with equal formality, his expression polite and unrevealing, but when his eyes met Eleanor's, there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch, a directness that seemed to actually see her rather than looking through her to the more interesting prospect beyond. He accepted tea from her mother and made appropriate conversation about the weather and the season for precisely 4 minutes before he did something that shattered every expectation Eleanor had carried into the room. He set down his cup with deliberate care, turned to Lady Ashworth with perfect courtesy, and requested the honour of speaking with Miss Eleanor Ashworth on a matter of some importance. The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the clock on the mantel ticking, could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears, could feel her mother's confusion and Lydia's outrage radiating across the space between them like heat from a fire. Her mother recovered first, her voice uncertain as she clarified that he meant Eleanor, not Lydia, and at his calm confirmation she gestured weakly for Eleanor to take the chair nearest the Duke, while she positioned herself at the required chaperoning distance, her face a study in bewildered calculation. Eleanor sat because her legs would not reliably hold her, her hands folded in her lap to still their trembling, her mind racing through possibilities, and finding none that made sense. And when Sebastian reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document sealed with wax, she stared at it without comprehension until he spoke in a voice that was firm and clear and directed entirely at her. "This property," Sebastian explained, with a steadiness that seemed to anchor the spinning chaos of the room, "had been your dowry settlement, Miss Ashworth, deeded to you by your maternal grandmother and meant to provide security and independence regardless of marriage, and it was lost to me 3 nights ago across a card table by your father. But such a loss was never legitimate because the property was never his to wager." Eleanor stared at the document he placed on the small table between them, the wax seal gleaming dully in the afternoon light, streaming through the drawing-room windows, and her mind struggled to process the meaning behind his words, even as her heart began a slow, painful expansion against the careful constraints she had built around it over years of learning not to hope. He continued speaking in that same measured tone, explaining that he had made inquiries with his solicitor and confirmed that the property, a small estate in Derbyshire with tenant farms and a modest house, had been explicitly settled upon her by her grandmother's will, that her father had acted illegally in using it as collateral, that the deed rightfully belonged to her, and he was simply returning what had been taken. She wanted to ask why, wanted to demand what he expected in return, wanted to protect herself from whatever trap this represented. But when she finally found her voice, it emerged thin and uncertain, asking what obligation this placed upon her, what service he required, what bargain he proposed. The silence that followed her question seemed to pulse with meaning, and she forced herself to raise her eyes from the document to his face, searching for the calculation or pity or cruel amusement she expected to find there. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like surprise, followed by an expression that might have been sadness. And when he spoke again, his voice was gentler but no less firm. "There is no obligation, Miss Ashworth, and no bargain. This is yours. It was always yours. I am simply ensuring it returns to its rightful owner." The words made no sense in the framework of the world as Eleanor understood it, where nothing came without price, and where women especially were currency to be traded and obligations to be managed. And she shook her head slightly, her hands gripping each other in her lap, hard enough that her knuckles whitened. Behind her, she could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath, could sense Lydia's confusion and growing outrage, could feel the entire room holding itself in suspended disbelief at this incomprehensible scene. Sebastian leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes intent on her face, with a focus that made her feel simultaneously exposed and strangely valued. And he said with perfect clarity that he understood her suspicion, that he would have been more concerned if she had accepted without question, but that she would find upon consulting any solicitor that the deed was legally transferred to her name, with no conditions, no requirements, and no strings of any kind attached. The document lay between them like a bridge across an impossible distance, and Eleanor felt something shifting in her chest, some long calcified belief beginning to crack under the pressure of this unprecedented act, this inexplicable kindness from a man who owed her nothing and who gained nothing from the gesture except perhaps the satisfaction of correcting an injustice that no one else had even acknowledged existed. Sebastian returned 4 days later, a span of time during which Eleanor had oscillated between examining the deed her solicitor confirmed was legitimately and unconditionally hers, and convincing herself that the Duke's momentary interest had been satisfied by his good deed and would now naturally fade back into the appropriate distance between their stations. So when the footman announced that His Grace requested the honour of taking Miss Eleanor driving in Hyde Park that afternoon, she felt the careful equilibrium she had constructed shatter into something uncomfortably close to hope. Her mother's face cycled through confusion and calculation before settling on an expression of determined encouragement, nodding permission with an eagerness that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with familiar shame. And within 20 minutes, she found herself handed up into Sebastian's curricle, a vehicle of restrained elegance drawn by matched bays whose coats gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, her hands folded carefully in her lap as he took the reins with the easy competence of a man accustomed to managing far more spirited creatures than horses. The park was populated with the usual parade of society taking the air, and Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares as they passed other carriages, could imagine the whispered speculation about why the Duke of Tremaine was driving the plain Ashworth daughter rather than her beautiful sister. But Sebastian seemed entirely unconcerned with the attention, guiding the horses along the main path with relaxed skill while he asked her opinion of a book he had noticed in his library that she might find interesting. The question was so unexpected, so specific in its reference to her actual interests, rather than the polite nothings typically exchanged during such outings, that Eleanor answered honestly before she could think better of it, admitting that she had read the volume in question and found the author's arguments about education reform both compelling and frustratingly limited in their consideration of women's capacity for the same rigorous study they advocated for men. Sebastian turned to look at her with an expression of such focused attention that she felt heat rise in her cheeks, and he asked what limitations she would address if given the authority to design an educational system, his tone suggesting genuine interest rather than the patronizing amusement she had learned to expect when she forgot to mute her opinions. She found herself talking, carefully at first, and then with increasing ease, about access to classical languages and mathematical study, about the assumption that women's minds were ornamental rather than instrumental, about the waste of half the population's intellectual potential, and he listened without interruption, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated he was actually considering her words rather than simply waiting for her to finish speaking. The horses walked at a leisurely pace, while Eleanor experienced the unprecedented sensation of being heard, of having her thoughts treated as valuable contributions rather than eccentricities to be tolerated. And when Sebastian observed that her ideas aligned closely with certain philosophical circles he participated in, and wondered if she might enjoy reading some of their published papers, she felt something dangerous blooming in her chest, a fragile, tentative unfurling that felt terrifyingly like the hope she had taught herself to suppress. The drive through Hyde Park became the subject of intense speculation within 24 hours, with whispers circulating through drawing rooms and over tea tables about the peculiar attention the Duke of Tremaine was paying to the unremarkable eldest Ashworth daughter. And Eleanor heard the gossip in fragments and undertones that painted her as object of either extraordinary pity or incomprehensible eccentricity on the part of a man known for his discernment and selectivity. Lady Pemberton remarked at the modiste's shop within Eleanor's hearing that it was wonderfully charitable of His Grace to take notice of poor Miss Ashworth, given her unfortunate situation and lack of prospects, the word charitable landing like a stone in Eleanor's chest, with its implication that kindness rather than genuine interest motivated Sebastian's attentions. Mrs. Hartwell speculated to a cluster of matrons at the lending library that perhaps the Duke had peculiar tastes that ran counter to conventional standards of beauty, a comment that generated knowing looks and barely suppressed laughter, while Eleanor pretended absorption in the book she held with trembling hands. Even more painful was the speculation that Sebastian was conducting some sort of social experiment, or fulfilling an obligation to her father, theories that aligned so perfectly with Eleanor's own deepest fears that she found them impossible to dismiss, despite the memory of how he had listened to her thoughts on education, how his questions had suggested actual engagement rather than polite tolerance. At home, the atmosphere shifted in ways both subtle and profound, with her mother suddenly taking interest in Eleanor's appearance and activities, suggesting new gowns and hairstyles with an attention that felt more calculating than affectionate, as though Eleanor had transformed overnight from disappointing burden to potential asset requiring proper management and display. Lydia's reaction was more straightforward in its hostility, her beautiful face tightening with resentment whenever Sebastian's name was mentioned, and she made pointed comments about how extraordinary it was that Eleanor should receive attention from a duke when she had never managed to attract interest from men of far lesser rank and fortune. The jealousy in her sister's voice should have provided some vindication, some satisfaction that Eleanor was finally the recipient rather than witness of male regard. But instead, it only amplified her internal conviction that this situation was temporary and unnatural, a brief aberration that would inevitably correct itself when Sebastian realized his mistake or tired of whatever impulse had prompted his initial kindness. Eleanor found herself trapped between the dangerous expansion of hope that occurred whenever she remembered their conversation, the way he had looked at her while she spoke about educational philosophy, as though her words mattered, and the crushing weight of probability that suggested a duke would never seriously pursue someone like her when he could have his choice of beautiful, accomplished women whose dowries had not been gambled away by reckless fathers. She began watching for signs of his withdrawal, preparing herself for the inevitable moment when his calls would cease and the brief, strange interlude of being noticed would fade into memory. Another confirmation that her proper place was in the shadows where unremarkable women belonged. The invitation arrived 3 days after the drive in Hyde Park, a heavy cream envelope bearing the ducal seal and containing a request for the Ashworth family to attend a garden party at Tremaine House the following Saturday. And Eleanor watched her mother's face transform with an excitement that felt more mercenary than maternal, while Lydia's expression curdled into barely concealed resentment that someone else's prospect, rather than her own approaching nuptials, had become the family's primary focus. The estate itself took Eleanor's breath when their carriage rolled through gates that opened onto grounds that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, manicured lawns giving way to strategic wilderness, flower gardens arranged in patterns that suggested both artistry and restraint, and a house of pale stone that managed to convey grandeur without ostentation, its classical lines speaking of old money and older dignity that required no vulgar display. Sebastian received them personally, and Eleanor noticed how he greeted each servant by name as they moved through the house toward the gardens where other guests already congregated, how he paused to inquire after a footman's mother who had been ill, how his attention to those of lower station was marked by the same courtesy he extended to titled guests, and she felt something shift in her chest at this evidence of character that went beyond the surface. Charm many men of his rank deployed like weaponry. The gardens were populated with perhaps 40 guests, a carefully curated mix of intellectual figures and select members of the nobility, and Eleanor found herself introduced to a philosopher whose work she had read, a blue-stocking whose essays on women's education had shaped Eleanor's own thinking, a poet whose verses she had memorized, and she realized with dawning wonder that Sebastian had constructed a guest list that reflected her interests rather than merely importing the usual society crowd. She was standing near the rose arbor, half listening to Lady Pemberton hold forth on the shocking forwardness of modern young women, when that lady turned to Eleanor with false sweetness and remarked that it was fortunate His Grace was so philanthropically inclined toward charity cases, else poor Miss Ashworth would never have opportunity to visit such grand establishments, and before Eleanor could summon a response through the hot shame flooding her chest, Sebastian's voice cut through the afternoon air with glacial precision, observing that he found Miss Ashworth's intellectual companionship far more valuable than the empty social performances some deemed accomplishments, and that any woman who measured worth by appearance rather than character revealed more about her own limitations than those she sought to diminish. The silence that followed was absolute, Lady Pemberton's face cycling through shock and humiliation before she retreated with mumbled excuses, and when Eleanor dared glance at Sebastian, she found him looking at her with an intensity that made her heart beat against her ribs like something caged and desperate, his public defense of her worth more intimate than any private declaration could have been, and she felt the dangerous hope she had been trying to contain spread through her chest like warmth returning to frozen limbs, terrifying in its implications, because hope meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the capacity for devastating pain. Sebastian appeared at her elbow perhaps 20 minutes after the confrontation with Lady Pemberton, his expression composed, but his eyes holding something Eleanor could not quite name, as he asked quietly if she might like to see the library, and she nodded because speech seemed impossible, with her heart still racing from the public defense he had offered, the way he had sliced through social pretense to name cruelty for what it was without apology or softening. The library occupied the entire east wing of the house, a cathedral to learning with shelves rising 2 stories toward a painted ceiling depicting classical scenes of wisdom and knowledge, late afternoon light streaming through tall windows to illuminate leather bindings in shades of burgundy and forest green and midnight blue, the scent of old paper and beeswax surrounding them like incense as Sebastian closed the door behind them, leaving it open precisely the width that propriety demanded, while still affording them something approaching privacy. He watched her take in the collection with an expression of quiet satisfaction, and Eleanor moved toward the shelves as though drawn by invisible threads, her fingers trailing along spines as she read titles that represented works she had longed to access, philosophical treatises and scientific journals and first editions of novels that shaped her understanding of what stories could accomplish. She paused before a section devoted to educational theory, pulling down a volume by Mary Wollstonecraft that she had only read in excerpted form, and Sebastian's voice came from behind her shoulder, remarking that his mother had collected most of the works on female education, that she had believed women's minds were starved by society's determination to feed them only accomplishments and restrict their access to substantive thought. Eleanor turned to find him closer than she had realized, near enough that she could see the green flecks in his hazel eyes, could smell sandalwood and something else uniquely him. And she heard herself ask what his mother would have thought of his attention to someone like her, immediately regretting the question because it revealed too much of her persistent disbelief that this situation could be real. Sebastian held her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch, saying his mother would have recognized in Eleanor exactly what he saw, a mind constrained by circumstances rather than capacity, a spirit that had learned to compress itself into the small space society allocated, but which remained fundamentally undiminished by that compression. She felt tears threaten at this characterization that suggested he saw not her limitations, but her potential, not what she lacked, but what she possessed despite every effort to diminish it. And she turned away under pretense of examining the upper shelves, needing distance from the dangerous intimacy of being so thoroughly understood. The library had a spiral stair leading to the second-level gallery, narrow wrought iron that required careful navigation in skirts, and Eleanor climbed without asking permission because movement felt safer than stillness. But halfway up she misjudged the width of her hem and stumbled, Sebastian's hand instantly at her waist, steadying her, his other hand covering hers on the railing. And for a suspended moment they froze in that configuration, the heat of his palm burning through the fabric of her dress, her own hand trapped beneath his larger one, both of them breathing too quickly for the minimal exertion. He did not immediately release her, and Eleanor found she could not move, could not think beyond the shocking awareness of his body close to hers, the strength in the hand that held her steady. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had heard it, roughened by something she dared not name. As he said, he had been alone most of his adult life, despite being constantly surrounded by people. That loneliness was not about quantity of company, but quality of connection. That he had resigned himself to a life of surface relationships until he met someone who looked at ideas the way most looked at jewels, with genuine hunger and appreciation for their value. Eleanor returned home from the garden party in a daze of confused feeling, the memory of Sebastian's hand at her waist and his words about loneliness and connection repeating in her mind with the insistence of a melody one cannot stop humming, and she moved through the evening in distracted silence, while her mother chattered about the superiority of the Duke's establishment, and Lydia made pointed remarks about charity cases being elevated beyond their natural station. She was ascending the stairs to her chamber when she heard her father's voice from his study, louder than usual with drink, and some instinct made her pause on the landing, even as she knew eavesdropping was both improper and often painful. But the words Duke and Eleanor carried clearly through the partially open door, and she found herself frozen in place, her hand gripping the banister as Lord Ashworth's voice took on the hearty tone he used when discussing business matters. He was speaking to someone she could not see, likely his man of affairs, and she heard him say that the Duke's interest was an unexpected stroke of fortune that could repair the family's finances if properly managed, that Eleanor was plain and grateful enough that she would do whatever was required to secure such an elevated match, that the girl had no other prospects, and must know this was her sole opportunity to be anything other than a burden. Eleanor felt the words land in her chest like physical blows, each one confirming what she had always suspected about how her family viewed her as a commodity to be traded, a problem to be solved, a fortunate accident that her worthlessness might finally serve some purpose through Sebastian's inexplicable interest. Her father continued with increasing crudeness, suggesting that Eleanor should be encouraged to secure the Duke's attachment by any means necessary before he came to his senses, that plain women often had to offer what prettier ones could withhold, and the implication was clear enough that Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat even as shame burned through her body like fever. She moved then, fleeing to her chamber before she could hear more, her hands shaking as she closed the door and pressed her back against it, breathing too quickly and feeling the careful hope she had been building over the past weeks crumble into something that tasted like ash and humiliation. Sebastian called 2 days later, and Eleanor refused to see him, pleading a headache that was not entirely false, given that she had barely slept since overhearing her father's conversation, had spent the hours replaying every interaction with the Duke and reinterpreting his kindness through the lens of pity, his attention through the assumption that he must view her as her father did, as someone so desperate that she would debase herself for the security of his name. He sent a note the following day requesting the pleasure of her company for a drive, and she sent back a polite but firm refusal, then another when he invited her to the theatre, and a third when he asked if he might call to discuss a book he thought she would enjoy. Her mother was frantic with confusion and anger, demanding to know what madness had possessed Eleanor to refuse a duke's attentions. But Eleanor could not explain that every invitation now felt like confirmation of her commodification, that she could not bear to sit across from Sebastian knowing her father expected her to trade her body for his title, that the shame of it made her want to disappear entirely, rather than face the one person who had briefly made her feel like something other than a problem to be solved. Eleanor had taken to seeking refuge in Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, during the mornings when her mother was occupied with callers, finding solace in the hushed atmosphere of leather and paper, where her presence drew no particular notice, and she could lose herself in volumes that asked nothing of her but attention, and it was there on the 4th day of her self-imposed isolation from Sebastian that the sky opened with the sudden violence that characterized early summer storms in London, rain hammering against the shop windows with such force that the proprietor began moving buckets to catch drips from a questionable section of roof. She had been examining a newly arrived translation of Italian poetry when the door opened with a gust of wind and wet, and she looked up to see Sebastian enter, his greatcoat darkened with rain across the shoulders, his hair disordered from the weather, and their eyes met. Across the shop with a jolt that Eleanor felt in her chest, like something physical and irrevocable. He approached slowly as though she were a wild creature that might bolt, which was precisely what she wanted to do, except that rain sheeted down outside with such force that leaving would mean arriving home soaked through and subject to her mother's interrogation about what emergency had necessitated such imprudence. So she stood trapped between the poetry section and the wall as Sebastian stopped an appropriate distance away and said her name as a question, as though he was not entirely certain she would acknowledge him. She managed a curtsy that felt stiff and awkward, her throat tight with the complicated mixture of longing and shame that had characterized her every waking moment since overhearing her father. And Sebastian looked at her with an expression that was part concern and part something firmer, as he asked very quietly if he had done something to offend her. If his attentions had been unwelcome in some way, he had failed to perceive. Eleanor shook her head, because whatever else was true, his attentions had been the opposite of unwelcome, had been the most welcome thing she had ever experienced, which was precisely why her father's words had cut so deeply, had poisoned something she had barely begun to believe might be real. Sebastian took a step closer, lowering his voice further, though the proprietor was occupied with his buckets, and they had this corner of the shop to themselves. And he said he had believed they were becoming friends, if nothing else, that he had thought she trusted him, at least enough to be honest if something was wrong. The word friends landed strangely in Eleanor's chest, both too small for what she had begun to feel, and too large, given what she had learned about her family's expectations, and she found herself speaking before conscious thought could intervene, the words emerging in a rushed whisper, as she said she had overheard her father discussing how she should secure his interest, how she should offer anything necessary to obtain his title, and she could not bear the humiliation of Sebastian knowing that her family viewed his attention as a transaction to be manipulated, and her as the commodity to be traded. She watched his expression change as she spoke, something dangerous entering his eyes that was not directed at her, but at what she was describing. And when she fell silent, he was quiet for a long moment, before asking with careful precision exactly what her father had said, and she could not repeat the worst of it, could only shake her head and look away as tears threatened to spill, despite her determination to maintain some shred of dignity. Sebastian reached out and then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side, and his voice when he spoke was low and intense, as he said he cared nothing for her father's machinations, that Lord Ashworth's views had no bearing whatsoever on his own, that he had sought Eleanor's company because she was interesting and intelligent and genuine in a world that offered precious little of any of those qualities. And if she believed he thought of her as anything other than a person of inherent worth, then she understood nothing of his character or his intentions. Sebastian called at the Ashworth residence 2 days after their encounter in the bookshop, and this time, when Eleanor received word that the Duke requested an audience, she found she could not refuse him, could not retreat back into protective isolation after he had stood in that rain-darkened shop and spoken of her worth with such fierce conviction that something in her chest had shifted irrevocably toward hope. He was shown into the drawing-room, where her mother sat with barely concealed anticipation, and he executed his bow with the formal grace that characterized all his movements before turning to Eleanor's mother and asking with perfect propriety if he might have permission to court Miss Ashworth with the intention of determining their mutual suitability for a more permanent arrangement. Eleanor felt the words land in the room like something physical, watched her mother's face cycle through shock and calculation and triumphant satisfaction before she granted permission with an excess of enthusiasm that made Eleanor wish to sink through the floor, and when her father was summoned and gave his consent with the hearty relief of a man whose greatest problem had just resolved itself, Eleanor had to resist the urge to flee again from the transactional nature of it all. But then Sebastian looked at her, really looked at her with those grey eyes that seemed to see past all her defences, and he asked very quietly if this was what she wanted, if she would consent to his courtship, and the fact that he asked her directly rather than simply accepting her father's authority made something in her throat grow tight with an emotion she could not entirely name. She nodded because she did not trust her voice, and his smile was small and private and seemed meant only for her despite the presence of her parents. And in that moment, she understood that whatever her family made of this arrangement, Sebastian viewed it as something that existed primarily between the two of them. The courtship that followed was a revelation of what it meant to be genuinely seen and pursued, not as a commodity or a problem to be solved, but as a woman whose preferences and comfort mattered at every turn. He took her driving through Hyde Park at the fashionable hour when all of society could observe them together, his hand steady on the reins and his attention wholly focused on her rather than the whispers that followed their passage. And he asked her opinions on matters ranging from literature to politics to the proper management of estates in ways that suggested he actually valued her thoughts rather than simply making conversation. They attended the opera with her mother as chaperone, and Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence beside her in the ducal box, the way his arm brushed hers when he leaned closer to murmur observations about the performance, the warmth of his gloved hand when he helped her with her wrap during the interval. He called at the house with such regularity that even the servants began to smile when they announced him, and gradually the formality between them softened in private moments, his address shifting from Miss Ashworth to Eleanor when her mother was occupied with her needlework, her own tentative use of Sebastian when they stood in the garden ostensibly examining the roses while actually discussing a novel they had both read. The gossip reached Eleanor on a grey afternoon 3 weeks into the courtship, when she and her mother were taking tea at Lady Pembridge's drawing-room, a weekly obligation that Eleanor had always endured with quiet resignation, but which had become newly uncomfortable now that she was the subject of speculation rather than merely invisible. And she was balancing her teacup with careful attention when she heard the words drift from the cluster of ladies near the window, their voices not quite low enough to be truly private. Lady Hartwick was speaking with the particular tone that society women used when delivering observations meant to wound while maintaining plausible deniability of malice, saying how very unusual it was that a Duke of Tremain's stature and eligibility should pursue a woman of Miss Ashworth's particular qualities, how one could only conclude he had rather unusual tastes, or perhaps a charitable inclination toward objects of pity, and Mrs. Pemberton responded with a tittering laugh that it was well known some gentlemen preferred women who would be grateful for attention rather than those who expected it as their due. Eleanor felt the words land in her chest like stones dropping into still water, the ripples spreading outward to disturb every moment of happiness she had begun to allow herself, and she set down her teacup with a hand that trembled only slightly, while her mother shot her a warning look that communicated clearly the expectation that she would maintain composure regardless of provocation. The afternoon dragged on with excruciating slowness, each moment requiring Eleanor to maintain her expression of polite attention, while internally she felt the careful structure of hope she had been building collapse back into the familiar architecture of resignation and self-doubt, because had she not always known this was too improbable, had she not understood from the beginning that a man like Sebastian would never genuinely prefer her unless there was something aberrant in his nature or calculated in his motives? She returned home and retreated to her room, claiming a headache that was not entirely fabricated, lying in the dimness with the curtains drawn, while her mind circled obsessively through every interaction with Sebastian, reinterpreting his attentiveness as pity and his interest as the peculiar preference of a man whose tastes ran to the pathetic and grateful. By evening she had determined that the kindest thing she could do for both of them was to release him from an obligation he had perhaps not fully understood he was creating, to withdraw gracefully before his courtship progressed to a point where ending it would cause scandal, and she was composing the mental phrasing of this noble sacrifice when Lydia entered without knocking and stood at the foot of her bed with an expression that mingled triumph and cruelty. Her sister said she supposed Eleanor had heard what everyone was saying, that the Duke must have very particular and somewhat unsettling preferences to pursue someone so thoroughly unremarkable, and perhaps Eleanor should consider whether she truly wished to marry a man whose interest in her suggested something aberrant in his character, because surely it was better to remain a spinster with dignity than to become a wife only because one's husband had peculiar tastes that precluded normal attraction. Lydia delivered this assessment with the particular viciousness that only a beautiful younger sister could muster toward a plainer elder sibling whose unexpected courtship had disrupted the natural order of things, and after she left, Eleanor lay in the darkness, feeling every word settle into the spaces where hope had briefly taken root, choking it out with the more familiar and perhaps more honest understanding that she had always been and would always be fundamentally unworthy of genuine desire. Sebastian arrived at the Ashworth residence the following afternoon without prior notice, and when Eleanor was informed of his presence, she sent word that she was indisposed and could not receive callers, a transparent excuse that fooled no one, least of all the Duke, who instructed the butler with quiet authority that he would wait as long as necessary and that Miss Ashworth should be informed he had no intention of leaving until she granted him an audience. Eleanor stood in her chamber feeling panic rise in her throat, because she had not yet composed the careful speech that would release him gracefully from obligation, had not yet armored herself sufficiently to face him while executing this necessary sacrifice, but her mother appeared at her door with an expression that brooked no refusal, and Eleanor found herself descending the stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He was standing by the window when she entered the drawing-room, and her mother took one look at his face and made a swift decision to position herself in the adjoining music-room with the door open for propriety while remaining far enough distant to grant them privacy. And Sebastian turned as Eleanor entered, and she saw immediately that he knew something had changed, could read it in the tension of her posture and the careful blankness of her expression. He crossed the room to her and asked very quietly what had happened, what had altered between their last meeting when she had smiled at something he said, and this moment when she could barely meet his eyes, and Eleanor opened her mouth to deliver her rehearsed words about not wishing to burden him with obligations that arose from misplaced kindness, only to find that the speech dissolved under the intensity of his gaze. Instead, she heard herself say with far too much honesty that she had realized she could not, in good conscience, allow him to continue a courtship that must be founded either in pity or in preferences that were aberrant, that she was releasing him from any sense of obligation he might feel toward her, and that she wished him every happiness with a woman more suited to his station and worthy of genuine regard. The silence that followed her words seemed to expand and fill the entire room, and when Sebastian finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled in a way that suggested he was keeping some powerful emotion tightly leashed. He asked who had put these thoughts in her head, what poison had been whispered to convince her that his interest in her was anything other than the natural inclination of a man toward a woman he had come to admire and desire. And the word desire landed between them like something physical that made Eleanor's breath catch, because surely he could not mean it in the way it sounded. He stepped closer, and she felt herself sway slightly, as though drawn by some force she could not resist. And he said her name like a command and a plea all at once before his hand came up to cup her face with a tenderness that contradicted the fierce intensity of his expression, and then he was kissing her with a passion that shattered every assumption she had ever made about propriety and restraint and the careful distance that should exist between a courting couple. Sebastian returned the following afternoon with a formality that seemed to restore the proper order of courtship after the passionate disruption of the previous day, and Eleanor received him in the drawing-room with her mother present, and her father summoned from his study to bear witness to what everyone in the household sensed would be a significant conversation, though Eleanor herself felt suspended in a state between disbelief and terrified hope that made it difficult to draw full breath. He was dressed impeccably in dark blue superfine that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the austere elegance that marked him as a man of consequence, and there was something in his bearing as he entered that commanded the attention of every person present, a quiet authority that made even her father straighten in his chair and her mother smooth her skirts with uncharacteristic nervousness. Sebastian exchanged the requisite pleasantries with her parents before turning to Eleanor with an expression of such focused intensity that she felt heat rise in her cheeks, and he asked with perfect propriety if she would do him the honor of walking with him in the garden, as there was a matter of some importance he wished to discuss with her, a request that was transparent in its intent, and which caused her mother to make a small sound of triumph that she attempted to disguise as a cough. They walked in silence for several moments after descending to the modest garden behind the townhouse, a space that had always seemed cramped and unremarkable to Eleanor, but which now felt charged with significance as Sebastian led her to the small stone bench beneath the aging oak tree, and when he turned to face her, she saw that despite his formal bearing, there was something vulnerable in his eyes that made her own uncertainty seem less isolating. He began by saying that he had never been a man given to impulsive decisions, that his life had been marked by careful consideration and strategic thinking, but that from the moment he had learned of her existence and the injustice done to her, he had felt compelled by something beyond logic or calculation, and as he had come to know her these past weeks, that compulsion had transformed into something far more profound and undeniable. He spoke then of specific qualities he had observed in her, and the detail of his accounting astonished her because he catalogued not vague pleasantries but particular moments that revealed he had been paying attention with an intensity she had not fully comprehended, noting her kindness to a clumsy footman who had spilled tea, her thoughtful questions about philosophy that demonstrated both intelligence and genuine curiosity, her dignity in the face of dismissal, her dry humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to lower her guard, the way she listened with complete attention when someone spoke as though their words truly mattered to her, and the strength of character that allowed her to endure years of being overlooked without becoming bitter or diminished. He said that these qualities comprised a kind of beauty that society was too blind to recognize, but which he saw clearly and valued above all the superficial attributes that others prized, and that he had fallen in love not despite who she was, but precisely because of it, because Eleanor Ashworth was exactly the woman he had not known he was searching for until fortune had brought news of her to his attention. The announcement of Eleanor Ashworth's engagement to Sebastian Tremaine, Duke of Tremaine, appeared in the morning papers on a Thursday, and by that evening every drawing-room in fashionable London buzzed with speculation and astonishment that recalibrated the social calculations of an entire season. The Countess of Pemberton's ball had been planned for weeks, but it took on new significance as the venue where the newly engaged couple would make their first public appearance, and Eleanor stood in her chamber while her mother fussed over the deep blue silk gown that Sebastian had commissioned for her from the finest modiste in London, a garment that transformed her not through artifice but through the simple fact of its perfect fit and elegant simplicity that suggested a woman worthy of such attention. The ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles when they arrived, and Eleanor felt the weight of every eye turn toward them as Sebastian led her down the stairs, with her hand resting on his arm, and she heard the whispers that rippled through the assembled guests like wind through wheat, a susurration of shock and hasty reassessment. Lady Harrington, who had once remarked within Eleanor's hearing that some women were destined to be maiden aunts and should accept it with grace, now smiled with determined warmth and congratulated Eleanor on her extraordinary good fortune, and Eleanor recognized the shift for what it was, not genuine regard, but social necessity in the face of her altered circumstances. Sebastian remained close throughout the evening, with a possessiveness that communicated clearly to every observer that Eleanor was not a charity case or peculiar preference, but a woman genuinely desired and valued, and when Lord Whitmore made an ill-judged comment about the Duke's surprising choice, Sebastian responded with such cold precision that the man stammered an apology and retreated. The dancing began, and Sebastian led Eleanor onto the floor for the first waltz, and she felt the strangeness of being at the center of attention rather than pressed against the wall among the chaperons and wallflowers, felt the way eyes tracked their movements with an intensity that would have terrified her weeks ago, but which now seemed almost irrelevant, because Sebastian was looking at her as though no one else existed in the glittering ballroom. He whispered that she was magnificent, and that every person watching them was finally seeing what he had recognized from the beginning. And Eleanor felt something shift inside her, not the desperate hope of earlier weeks, but a settling certainty that this was real and permanent, and hers by right rather than charity. Miss Hartwell, who had been among the cruelest of Eleanor's detractors, approached during supper with transparent envy, poorly disguised as friendly interest, asking how Eleanor had managed to secure the Duke's regard, and Eleanor responded with a graciousness that required no cruelty because she no longer needed vindication from those who had dismissed her. Sebastian appeared at her elbow with champagne and a look of such open affection that several nearby observers actually gasped, and Eleanor understood in that moment that her transformation was complete, not because she had changed, but because she had finally allowed herself to be seen. The morning after the ball, Eleanor descended to breakfast, expecting the usual quiet meal with only her father hidden behind his newspaper, but instead found her mother already dressed and animated in a way that set Eleanor's nerves on edge, and within moments of her sitting down, Lady Ashworth began a breathless recounting of the previous evening's triumph that positioned herself as the architect of Eleanor's engagement through her careful guidance and maternal wisdom. Eleanor listened with a composure that felt hard-won as her mother rewrote history with astonishing creativity, claiming she had always known Eleanor possessed hidden qualities that would eventually attract the right sort of gentleman, conveniently omitting years of dismissive comments and cold indifference that had marked Eleanor's adult life until Sebastian's interest had transformed her from overlooked burden to social asset. Lord Ashworth entered, looking both relieved and vaguely ashamed, and he cleared his throat several times before congratulating Eleanor with an awkwardness that reminded her painfully of the night he had gambled away her dowry, though now he seemed eager to position himself as a fond father pleased by his daughter's excellent match rather than the reckless man whose actions had precipitated the entire sequence of events. He suggested they should have a family dinner to celebrate properly, and perhaps he might offer the Duke some advice on investments, a presumption that made Eleanor's jaw tighten because her father apparently believed Sebastian's connection to her granted him renewed access to opportunities his own poor judgment had squandered. Her mother immediately seized on this idea and began planning an intimate family gathering where they might all become better acquainted, speaking as though the Ashworth family and the Duke were now united in bonds of affection rather than connected primarily through Sebastian's love for Eleanor alone. The breakfast room door opened with more force than necessary, and Lydia entered with colour high in her cheeks and an expression that Eleanor recognized as the particular blend of fury and wounded pride her sister exhibited when denied something she believed should be hers by right. Lydia sat down with deliberate precision and helped herself to toast with movements sharp enough to rattle the china. And when their mother enthused about the previous evening's success, Lydia observed with acid sweetness that it was remarkable how charitable some gentlemen could be, and how fortunate that the Duke had such unusual preferences. The comment landed in the sudden silence like a stone through glass, and Eleanor felt the old familiar shame begin to rise before something new asserted itself, a clarity born of Sebastian's unwavering regard that allowed her to see her sister's cruelty for what it was, not truth, but jealousy dressed in concern. Eleanor set down her teacup with careful control and said quietly that she understood Lydia might find the situation difficult, but that Eleanor would not tolerate disrespect toward her betrothed or their engagement in her presence, and the firmness in her own voice surprised her even as she spoke. The wedding preparations began in earnest the following week when Sebastian arrived at the Ashworth residence with his secretary and a formidable woman named Mrs. Hartwell who managed his household affairs, and Eleanor found herself ushered into the drawing-room where Sebastian immediately asked what sort of ceremony she envisioned and what would make her happiest, a question that struck her with unexpected force because no one had ever inquired about her preferences for anything significant. She thought of Lydia's wedding planning the previous year, how their mother had orchestrated every detail from the flowers to the guest list while Lydia had preened and approved, and how Eleanor had been consulted only on the most menial tasks like addressing invitations and keeping lists, and the contrast between that experience and this moment where Sebastian waited with genuine interest for her thoughts made her throat tighten with emotion she struggled to contain. She admitted quietly that she had never truly imagined a wedding for herself, and would defer to his judgment on what was appropriate for a duke, but Sebastian leaned forward with that intense focus he gave her, and said he cared nothing for what was appropriate, and everything for what would bring her joy, and Eleanor felt the by now familiar sensation of her old assumptions crumbling beneath the steady pressure of his regard. They discussed dates, and Mrs. Hartwell made notes with brisk efficiency, and when Eleanor tentatively suggested she had always loved spring flowers, Sebastian smiled and said they would marry in 6 weeks when the gardens at his estate would be at their finest, and he would have flowers brought from his greenhouses to fill whatever church she preferred. His hand found hers on the settee, and he traced his thumb across her knuckles in a gesture that seemed unconscious, but which sent warmth spreading through her body, and Eleanor became acutely aware of how his presence affected her now in ways both emotional and physical, a heightened consciousness of his nearness that made her breath catch when he leaned close to examine the fabric samples Mrs. Hartwell presented. Sebastian asked about her favorite colors and whether she preferred intimate gatherings or grand celebrations, and when Eleanor confessed she would be content with something small. He regarded her with such tenderness that Mrs. Hartwell discreetly found reason to consult with the secretary across the room. Sebastian said softly that he wanted to give her everything she had been denied, wanted the world to witness his claim on her and her acceptance of him, wanted a celebration worthy of the happiness she had brought into his previously hollow existence, and Eleanor realized he needed this public declaration as much for himself as for her, needed to stand before society and declare his choice. She agreed to a proper wedding at St. George's with a breakfast at his London residence, and Sebastian pressed a kiss to her hand that lingered longer than propriety allowed, while his eyes promised things that made anticipation pool low in her belly and color rise in her cheeks. Eleanor woke on her wedding morning to pale spring sunlight filtering through the curtains of her childhood bedroom, and for a long moment she lay still beneath the covers, trying to comprehend that this day had actually arrived, that in a few short hours she would stand before God and society and become the Duchess of Tremaine, would bind herself forever to a man who had looked past every limitation others saw in her and chosen her with a conviction that still sometimes stole her breath. The house stirred around her with unusual early activity, and soon her mother entered, followed by a maid carrying chocolate and toast, and Lady Ashworth's manner held an effusiveness that Eleanor endured with patience, born of knowing she would soon leave this house, and its complicated emotions behind for a life built on entirely different foundations. The gown that arrived from Madame Leblanc's establishment was silk, the color of champagne, with delicate embroidery at the hem and sleeves, elegant without being ostentatious, exactly what Eleanor had described wanting when Sebastian had insisted she commission something that pleased her rather than what fashion dictated, and when the modiste herself arrived to oversee the dressing, she pronounced Eleanor a bride of excellent taste and distinguished bearing. Eleanor stood before her mirror as the gown was fastened, and her hair arranged in soft curls woven through with pearls that had been Sebastian's gift the previous evening, along with a note that simply read, "These pale beside your beauty, but perhaps they will know the honor of adorning you," words that had made her press the card to her heart with wonder at how thoroughly he had dismantled her lifetime of believing herself unworthy of such devotion. The transformation she saw in the mirror was not one of features magically altered, but of posture changed, shoulders back and chin lifted, eyes that met their own reflection with something that looked remarkably like confidence. And she understood finally that what Sebastian had seen in her from the beginning was now becoming visible even to herself. The carriage ride to St. George's passed in a blur of London streets and her father's nervous attempts at conversation until they arrived to find the church steps lined with observers drawn by news that the Duke of Tremaine was wedding the unremarkable eldest Ashworth daughter, and Eleanor felt the weight of their curious stares as her father handed her down. The church interior was filled with spring flowers that turned the ancient space into a garden bower, and Eleanor's eyes sought and found Sebastian, waiting at the altar in his formal attire with an expression that made everything else fade to insignificance, because he looked at her as though she were the answer to every question he had ever asked. And when she reached his side, he took her hand with fingers that trembled slightly as he whispered, "You are so beautiful." And Eleanor felt beautiful for the first time in her life, not because her appearance had changed, but because she was wholly and completely beloved. The carriage journey to Sebastian's country estate took them through rolling countryside that gradually gave way to formal parkland as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. And Eleanor sat beside her husband, feeling the word reverberate through her consciousness with each turn of the wheels. Husband, a term she had never expected to claim, and certainly not attached to a man like Sebastian, who even now held her hand with absent tenderness while pointing out landmarks on his property. The house came into view as they rounded a curve in the drive, and Eleanor caught her breath at the sight of the golden stone facade glowing in the late afternoon light, mullioned windows reflecting the sky, gardens stretching in geometric precision toward wooded parkland beyond, and Sebastian watched her reaction with obvious pleasure as he explained that this had always been his favorite residence, and he was glad to finally share it with someone who would appreciate its beauty as he did. The staff assembled on the front steps, and Sebastian handed her down with ceremonial formality before introducing her as the Duchess to the housekeeper and butler, and assembled servants who bowed and curtsied with expressions ranging from curiosity to carefully concealed assessment. And Eleanor felt the weight of this new identity settle more fully onto her shoulders, even as Sebastian's hand at the small of her back provided steady reassurance. He led her through rooms filled with the accumulated treasures of generations, pointing out family portraits and architectural features with the enthusiasm of someone sharing something precious, and Eleanor understood that he was not simply showing her a house, but offering her a life, a place, a belonging she had never possessed, even in her childhood home. Tea was served in a salon overlooking the gardens, and they sat together on a settee positioned to catch the last rays of sunlight, and Sebastian fed her strawberries from the tray while asking if she was pleased with everything and whether she felt any nervousness about the evening ahead, his directness about what awaited them making her blush, but also relieving her of the need to pretend ignorance or feign shock. He took her reddened cheeks between his palms and told her with absolute seriousness that they would proceed entirely at her comfort, that his only desire was for her happiness and pleasure, that she must tell him if anything frightened or distressed her, and the tender concern in his eyes made Eleanor's throat tighten because even in this most intimate matter, he thought first of her well-being and consent. The housekeeper showed Eleanor to the Duchess's chambers, where her belongings had been unpacked and a bath prepared, and she soaked in hot water scented with roses while trying to calm the flutter of anticipation and nervousness that made her heart race and her skin feel overly sensitive. The maid helped her into a nightgown of fine lawn with lace at the throat and wrists, far more delicate than anything she had owned before, and brushed out her hair until it fell in soft waves down her back. And when the connecting door opened and Sebastian appeared in his shirt sleeves, Eleanor felt desire pool in her belly, despite her inexperience, because the way he looked at her made her feel cherished and wanted and beautiful in ways that transcended physical appearance. Eleanor woke the morning after her wedding night to find Sebastian already awake beside her, propped on one elbow watching her with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that she felt heat rise to her cheeks even as she smiled and reached to touch his face, marveling that this was now her reality, waking beside this man who had shown her with such patience and reverence the night before that intimacy could be an extension of the emotional connection they had built rather than the frightening unknown she had anticipated. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt like discovering a language she had always been meant to speak. Mornings when they breakfasted together in the sunny breakfast room overlooking the rose gardens, and Sebastian shared his correspondence and asked her opinions on estate matters with genuine interest in her thoughts, afternoons when they walked the grounds together or rode out to visit tenants, and Eleanor began to understand the scope of her new responsibilities and found herself unexpectedly energized by the prospect of being useful in meaningful ways. Sebastian had a study lined with maps and ledgers where he managed his various properties and investments, and he invited her to join him there, explaining his stewardship philosophy and asking what causes she might wish to support with the considerable resources now at her disposal. And Eleanor felt something bloom inside her chest at the recognition that she was being offered not just his name and protection, but true partnership in building a life of purpose. They read together in the evenings, sometimes aloud to each other, and sometimes into companionable silence in adjacent chairs. And Eleanor discovered that Sebastian had a weakness for Gothic novels, despite his ducal dignity, and would become so engrossed that he forgot to maintain his usual composed expression, and she loved him even more for these glimpses of unguarded enthusiasm. Physical affection became as natural as breathing, his hand finding hers as they walked, his lips brushing her temple when he passed her chair, her fingers straightening his cravat before dinner, and the passion they shared in the privacy of their chambers deepened with familiarity as Eleanor shed the last vestiges of uncertainty about her desirability, and learned to both receive and initiate touch without self-consciousness. One afternoon, as they reviewed plans for improvements to the tenant cottages, Sebastian set down his pen and simply looked at her until she asked what he was thinking, and he said, "I am thinking that I have never been so content, that every day with you confirms what I knew from the beginning, that you are extraordinary, and I am the most fortunate of men." And when Eleanor protested that she was merely herself, he pulled her into his lap and told her with fierce conviction that herself was everything, that her kindness and intelligence and dignity were worth more than all the shallow beauty in Christendom, and Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe him completely, to release the last whisper of doubt that this love might be temporary or conditional, and she kissed him with a freedom that still sometimes surprised her, and whispered that he had given her not just a title or security, but the ability to see herself as worthy. And Sebastian held her close and promised that he would spend every day of their lives ensuring she never forgot it. Their return to London in late autumn came with considerably more fanfare than Eleanor had anticipated, and as their carriage rolled through streets grown familiar from her previous life as an overlooked daughter, she marveled at how profoundly her circumstances had altered, while the city itself remained unchanged, the same townhouses lining the squares, the same vendors calling their wares. Yet now she observed it all from the privileged vantage of the Duchess of Tremaine, with Sebastian beside her pointing out landmarks and squeezing her hand when he sensed her nervousness at re-entering society in this elevated capacity. The invitations had begun arriving even before they reached Tremaine House. Thick cream envelopes embossed with aristocratic seals, every hostess in London suddenly desperate for the honor of the Duke and his new Duchess gracing their gatherings, and Eleanor could not help the bitter irony of remembering how these same households had barely acknowledged her existence mere months ago when she was plain Eleanor Ashworth, with no prospects and a gambler for a father. Sebastian seemed to read her thoughts as he sorted through the correspondence, and remarked with dry amusement that society was nothing if not predictable in its worship of rank, and that she should take satisfaction in making them wait for her favor rather than feeling obligated to accept every invitation. And Eleanor felt a rush of affection for this man who so clearly understood the complicated emotions stirred by her transformation. They chose a select few events to attend, beginning with a musical evening at Lady Pemberton's, where Eleanor walked in on Sebastian's arm wearing sapphires that matched her gown and felt the room's attention shift toward her like a physical force. Conversations pausing mid-sentence as heads turned to observe the woman who had somehow captured the most eligible duke in England, despite possessing none of the obvious qualifications society deemed necessary. Eleanor held her head high and smiled with genuine warmth at those who approached to offer congratulations, and she noticed with quiet satisfaction how many people who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now stumbled over themselves to secure her attention and goodwill. The transformation was most evident when she encountered Lady Thornton, a woman who had once remarked within Eleanor's hearing that some women were simply born to be spinster aunts and should accept their lot with grace rather than embarrassing themselves by attending social functions. And now this same lady approached with effusive compliments about Eleanor's gown and jewellery, and barely concealed hunger to be acknowledged by the new Duchess. Eleanor met her gaze steadily, and said with perfect politeness that she appreciated the kind words, that she had learned much in recent months about the difference between surface judgments and true character, that she hoped Lady Thornton would join her in supporting a charity she was establishing to provide dowries for young women whose families could not adequately provide for them. And she watched the older woman's face cycle through surprise and chagrin and forced enthusiasm as she agreed that it sounded like a worthy cause. Sebastian materialized at Eleanor's elbow moments later, with champagne and a look of undisguised pride, and he leaned close to murmur that she had handled that encounter with more grace than Lady Thornton deserved, that watching her move through society with confidence and purpose was one of his greatest pleasures, and Eleanor felt the last lingering shadow of her former insecurity dissolve in the warmth of his admiration, and her own hard-won understanding that she had always possessed worth even when others failed to recognize it. Eleanor discovered the true measure of how far she had traveled from her former self on a grey December afternoon when she attended a modest gathering at the home of Mrs. Hartley, a respectable widow who opened her drawing-room weekly to young women seeking intellectual conversation beyond the usual social frivolities, and there, among the earnest faces discussing a recent philosophical treatise, Eleanor noticed a girl of perhaps 20, sitting silent in the corner with the particular quality of invisibility Eleanor recognized with a pang of memory as her own former condition. The girl was plain in the way Eleanor had been called plain, which was to say not fashionably pretty, with intelligent eyes that watched the room with a mixture of hunger and resignation. And Eleanor observed how the other young women unconsciously angled away from her in their conversations, how she was offered tea last, how her tentative attempt to contribute a thought was spoken over by a more confident voice. Eleanor moved to sit beside her during the interval and introduced herself simply, asking the girl her name and what she thought of the text under discussion, and watched the young woman's face transform with startled pleasure at being directly addressed by someone of Eleanor's rank and reputation. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and her situation emerged gradually through gentle questions. A younger daughter of a country squire, whose modest portion had been lost through poor investments, now living with a married sister in London and facing the grim prospect of becoming a permanent dependent with no resources and no prospects. And Eleanor felt her heart contract with recognition of that particular despair. She spoke with Clara for nearly half an hour, learning of her love of history and languages, her resignation to a future of genteel poverty and invisibility, and Eleanor found herself sharing carefully selected pieces of her own story. How recently she too had believed herself destined for permanent obscurity. How circumstances could shift in unexpected ways. How worth existed independent of dowries and conventional beauty. When Sebastian arrived to collect her as arranged, Eleanor introduced him to Clara and watched the girl's amazement that the Duke would speak to her with the same courtesy he might show a duchess. And Eleanor felt Sebastian's hand warm at her back as he invited Miss Whitmore to call at Tremaine House the following week to discuss a position as companion and assistant in Eleanor's charitable work. In the carriage afterward, Sebastian pulled Eleanor close and told her that watching her extend kindness born of understanding rather than condescension was one of the qualities he most admired, that her capacity for empathy had not been diminished, but rather amplified by her happiness. And Eleanor leaned into his warmth and reflected on how suffering could either harden or sensitize a heart, and she was grateful that hers had chosen the latter path. That evening, as they sat together in his study reviewing plans for the dowry fund that would bear both their names, Eleanor spoke of wanting to build something lasting, a legacy that would help girls like Clara and like her former self find pathways to dignity and choice. And Sebastian listened with the attention he always gave her ideas, and then added his own thoughts about expanding the scope to include education and employment opportunities. They talked long into the night about their shared vision for using their resources to challenge the systems that rendered women invisible and worthless when they failed to meet arbitrary standards. And Eleanor felt a sense of purpose settling into her bones alongside the love and security she had found, a recognition that her own painful journey had equipped her to ease the path for others. And when Sebastian finally led her upstairs to their chambers, he whispered that she had become exactly what he always knew she could be, not despite her past struggles, but because of them. And Eleanor knew he was right. The May afternoon was unseasonably warm when Eleanor sat in the sunlit nursery at Tremaine House with her daughter Sophia cradled against her shoulder, the infant barely 6 months old with Sebastian's dark hair, and what Eleanor hoped might be her own thoughtful eyes, and as she rocked gently in the chair that had been specially commissioned for this room, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary improbability of this moment, that she who had been so certain of a life lived in the margins should now be holding her own child in a home filled with love and security and purpose beyond anything she had imagined possible in those dark days after her father gambled away her future. Sophia made a small, contented sound, and Eleanor looked down at the perfect features relaxed in sleep, and thought about all the things she would teach this daughter, that her worth was inherent and not dependent on the judgments of others, that kindness and intelligence mattered more than conventional beauty, that she should never resign herself to invisibility simply because the world tried to render her so. And Eleanor felt fierce protective love surge through her at the thought of shielding this child from the wounds she herself had carried for so long. The door opened softly, and Sebastian entered with the particular smile he reserved for finding his wife and daughter together, and he crossed to them and bent to kiss first Sophia's downy head, and then Eleanor's lips, with a tenderness that still had the power to make her breath catch, even after 2 years of marriage. And when he settled into the chair beside them and reached to take Eleanor's free hand, she felt the complete rightness of this life they had built together. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes before Sebastian remarked that Clara Whitmore had written to say that 2 more young women had been placed in respectable positions through the fund, and that the inquiries were increasing weekly, and Eleanor felt satisfaction bloom at the knowledge that their work was expanding to touch more lives, that her own painful journey was being transformed into pathways of dignity for others. Sebastian squeezed her hand and said that he could not have imagined, when he won that property deed in a card game, how profoundly it would alter his life, that setting out to return what was rightfully hers had led him to the one person who could truly understand him and match him in partnership. And Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder and reflected that she too could not have foreseen how a morning of devastation would ultimately lead to this harvest of joy. And now, dear listener, I speak directly to you who have perhaps felt overlooked or undervalued or resigned to a lesser life than you dreamed. Know that Eleanor's story is not merely a tale of historical romance, but a truth that echoes across time. That your worth exists independent of others' recognition. That dignity maintained through difficulty is never wasted. That love and purpose can arrive in the most unexpected ways when you have almost ceased to hope for them. Your journey may not look like Eleanor's with dukes and ballrooms, but the essential truth remains that you deserve to be seen and valued and loved for exactly who you are. I invite you to carry this story with you as a reminder that transformation is possible, that it is never too late for new beginnings. And if this tale has touched your heart, I hope you will join our community of listeners who gather to hear stories of love, overcoming limitation, and worth ultimately recognized. Until we meet again in another story, may you walk in the knowledge of your own inherent value, and may you find the courage to claim the life you deserve.